Good afternoon, everyone. This is Mike Dane with MLS Technology. Today we're going to be doing a quick overview of our rules and regulations. Before we get started with the actual course content, I did want to run through a couple just basic things with our webinars. Looks like hopefully we'll have a couple more people joining us, but as always, you guys are going to be starting on mute by default. We're going to offer an option to allow you guys to ask some questions during the course using that raise hand option. But since this is going to be a little bit more of a cut and dry thing, we'll try and make sure that we're staying focused on the basic content, and then of course we'll have a little bit of time for Q&A at the end, hopefully. There is a Q&A button down there at the very bottom of the screen. That's where you guys can post any questions you would like to ask. In case you guys do end up wanting to ask a question with your voice, again, we'll use that raise hand option. Now, the chat section is going to be great if you guys have any comments, examples that you guys want to share, any stories that you would like to share. Just post those into the chat section. We are going to mention this during the course, but just as a reminder, in case we bring up an example of something or a rule that maybe you might have been guilty of violating at some point in time, please don't feel the need to let us know or let me know. This is just meant to be kind of a lesson, open forum kind of situation. We don't need to try and get into the specifics or self-incriminate anybody. But we'll get the session recorded. I'm going to be sending a link out. And for those of you guys, actually, I think almost everybody here has participated in this morning's class. We'll have that class recording sent off around the same time that we have this one sent off. I'm just waiting for Zoom to get both of those collected. Also, I wanted to mention if you have any audio or video issues during the course, please let me know immediately. Hit that raise hand button, hit the chat or Q&A and type out whatever the issue is. If you're having issues, there's always a good chance that you might be experiencing the same thing that someone else is experiencing. So let me know as quickly as possible. We want to try and make sure that everybody that participates is going to be able to get the CE credit, and any kind of technological issues that might occur during this hopefully won't prevent you from getting that CE credit. We'll also be getting the CE credit sent off to OREC after the class is over. That should be applied to your license before the end of the month, but if you do end up noticing any delays in that, just double check with us. We send off the information pretty quickly after class is over today, but we have seen some delays. Oftentimes it's just because OREC is working on or recently changed to a new system. I'm not sure where they are in that process, but typically it's going to be added before the end of the month anyway, so not to worry, should be there. All right. Also, as far as the buttons go, we do have a couple extra options down there at the bottom. As mentioned, we have chat, Q&A, raise hand if you guys would like to ask a question with your voice. If you're joining us on a mobile device, it's just going to be the same options. You just have to hit the space or hit the screen to make those buttons appear at the bottom. Again, raise hand for any questions you want to ask with voice, Q&A for questions, chat for commentary. All right. About half a minute, then we'll go ahead and get started with the course content. I just want to make sure that we're giving everybody an opportunity to actually get signed into the class. And in the interim, get this pulled up. Oh, hey, Janet. Oh, actually, there you go. Yeah, there should be a prompt if you'd like to ask your question. Hey, you're live? Oh, did you have a question, Janet?
Oh, I was just signing in.
Oh, no worries. Yeah, you're good.
Okay.
All right. Well, it's 1:05. We're going to go ahead and get started with the course content. For those of you guys who stick through to the end, you will be eligible for CE credit. Hey, Claire, I see you. Oh, We had a couple more people that were hoping to join, but that's all right. So we're going to start. So the rules and regulations class, I did want to clarify just a couple things before we actually start with the overview of the rules themselves. I first wanted to discuss where to find the rules and regulations and how to do so you're always looking at the most up-to-date version. We have had some people in the past who have downloaded the rules and regs and then subsequently had some questions that weren't addressed in them because we made some updates since the last time they had gotten a fresh copy. So I wanted to show you guys where that can be found. So when you get signed into the MLS portal, there's going to be a section down here at the bottom that says governing documents. Depending on how large or small your screen is, you may not see it immediately and you might have to scroll. But there's a little blue icon with the gavel. Just hit that governing documents. And the current MLS rules and regulations are actually going to be found on this right-hand column. So MLS Tech Rules and Regs. Another thing I wanted to address, because we're going to be discussing a couple very specific sections as we're going through before we get to the add edit phase. If you do end up finding yourself wondering about a specific rule or maybe a specific thing within the rules, there is a option that's built into the PDF, the browser, the software that you guys are using to look at the PDF that's going to allow you to search throughout the entire document. Now, for those of you guys who have been around on computers a lot, this may be a little bit of a rehashing of something that you guys already use frequently. But for those of you guys who haven't had too much time with that, or maybe just haven't memorized this particular function, if you do Control and then the F key, F as in find, Control F will bring up a little prompt down at the bottom of the screen that says find. In the case of Firefox, which I'm currently using, it'll say find in page. And if you guys happen to be using maybe Chrome or Adobe, it may end up appearing in a different location. So for instance, if I wanted to search within Chrome or even in Adobe's own software, Adobe Reader, there will be a little prompt up at the top here that you can type in your text. So whenever you guys are searching for something, you can just do that Control F and type in whatever the word is. So for instance, if I wanted to find out if there was any rules on coming soon, I can type in coming soon. And notice how it actually is mentioning that there's 24 times that that specific phrase appears throughout this document. And it even highlights that in Chrome. Other pieces of software may not do the same. So for instance, if I typed in coming soon in Firefox, you'll see 23 matches. It's just trying to eradicate one of the duplicates there. But if you guys ever need to navigate around within the files, at least for PDFs, Chrome does a fantastic job, Adobe Reader does a fantastic job, but it may look different on each piece of software. It's still going to be the same function. So Control F as in find. Strongly recommend that you guys use that. That works in a lot of different pieces of software, so take advantage of that when you can. We also wanted to mention something that you guys might have noticed in the past. I'm hoping not, but we do have a system automated function that's going to keep track of some of the rules that we've established to ensure that any of the listings that are being put into our system match all of the criteria of our rules. This is called the listing data checker. And what it'll do is whenever a listing gets added into the system or gets modified within the system, it'll do a little quick pass through that data to match up against any of the more obvious rules that we have. This doesn't mean that every single violation will be caught, unfortunately. So there is some self-reporting, which we'll be discussing a little bit later. But if you guys ever notice that there's an email that's been sent to you that has some guidelines on maybe what it is that was done wrong or how to fix it, this doesn't always necessarily mean that you're getting a fine. In fact, there's actually a lot of courtesy notices to make sure that if you do end up putting something incorrect in the system, it'll try and at least warn you and give you some education rather than just immediately going to sending a fine to you. So those listing data checker emails, please keep track of those. Those are oftentimes just going to have some basic information. Other times they might have something that's mission critical. I know it's kind of commonplace not to read everything that's been emailed to you, but oftentimes we do get phone calls on the service desk asking us about something that was emailed to someone And we'll have specific information in those emails that might have guided you through exactly what you needed to do. Just keep track of that stuff. But if you do have any questions, also don't hesitate to give us a call, even if it's something that was explained relatively clearly in the email. If you guys have follow-up questions, reach out to us. We're here. Also, as I already mentioned when we were talking about the chat or the Q&A option, if you guys do end up having something mentioned in the class that you might have violated in the past or might have been an issue with one of your listings, you don't have to mention it. I know that this seems like something that people might not do. We had more of an issue with this when we were doing these classes in person, because people would want to argue with us about something or mention that it wasn't fair that something happened. And I can appreciate those things, but during the class is not the time or place to do so. If you do have any concerns though, again, get in contact with us. We'd be more than willing to field some of those questions. And we often do end up kind of being the lightning rod for some of those issues here on the service desk. And we've sent a pretty hefty amount of requests to get the rules and regulations updated through our system. So we are there for you, but we'd prefer not to discuss any specific examples during the course itself. All right, cool. Let's get started with the basic premise of the MLS. So the importance of accurate MLS information is kind of the impetus of all of the rules and regulations that we have. So just to make sure that we end up having robust MLS data that you guys can use as MLS members, we also have the option to syndicate this information out, which means that third-party people will be viewing this information, public will be viewing this information. We want to ensure that all of the data that's being put into our system is accurate and timely. We also want to make sure that everything falls in line with our rules and regulations so that it follows by the rules for cooperation and compensation. So not only is complete and accurate data important to effectively marketing properties, as you guys are probably painfully aware, but the long-term benefit is also better, more accurate appraisals and CMAs for future listing support. Now, the benefits of detailed listings in the MLS range from obviously greater market exposure to effectively matching a buyer and seller together to accurate market analysis even. So you may be asking what type of information should be included in the MLS? And it's a pretty simple answer: as much information as you can put into the system. This means if you guys have no information on maybe how the roof is built or what the construction type is, it would behoove you to try and find that information before you start getting the listing put in. We'll be discussing the property data form in a bit here so you guys can see how robust our data can be. Though we have noticed a trend recently where a lot of listings are missing some of those crucial pieces of information, which is really just going to hurt the listing agent more than anyone else. So this is especially true of the features that we have a direct influence on value. Detailed data in features and amenities, and even the remarks field not only help you guys sell a property, but also help other agents and appraisers substantiate value for their property, as well as just obviously, again, making good comps for future sales, which is something that everybody would want. So make sure that you guys are putting everything that you can into the listing. It's going to maximize your listing's effectiveness. So pictures, features, amenities, make sure that you guys have detailed and descriptive data in the remarks fields, because the bottom line is the success of the real estate professionals throughout the entire industry is going to be directly related to the accuracy, the quantity, and the quality of the information that's been provided to the MLS. Now, let's get started with just some of the basic stuff. Just to get this out of the way, this isn't always necessarily my favorite topic to discuss, but we do have a lot of rules that are being violated on an unfortunately regular basis. Now, the anticipated closing dates are one of the things that we've noticed the most issues with. I know this doesn't feel like a particularly important thing to have to worry about, but just like we mentioned, we always want to try and get accurate data. Now, if the listing is past the anticipated closing date, then we need to have it either closed or to have the date updated. It's really that simple. I know that we end up having a lot of pushback on the fines that are being sent out, but Oftentimes, the reason why we're even trying to push people to fix this is because if a property has closed, we need to make sure that that's represented. If the property is going to close in the future, we need to make sure that that date is pushed out so that there is a reminder sent in case, again, property closed and you guys didn't have that updated. I also wanted to mention that these fines, or there are fines related to this, fines that the rules has clearly stated for years. In fact, actually the first rule to start fining for the anticipated closing date was put into the books back in 2010. Now, previously we'd have been avoiding trying to fine people, actually for everything, but we were trying to stick to our rules that we have established because there was a reason why we ended up needing to have this stuff instituted. We have shifted focus to ensure that all of the rules are being abided by all of the members equally. So in the spirit of that equity, we need to follow the rules ourselves to update them to our new standards. We did decide to keep this rule in place due to the abundance of warnings that we send out in advance of a fine. And in fact, actually, just to cover that real quick, because I have that mentioned on our slide here, the fine is actually going to be 30 days after the first notice is sent. So we send a notice in Matrix, which you guys may notice. There's a little section for that. In fact, actually, I think I have that pulled up. No, I did close out of Matrix. You will notice those announcements over here under news and alerts. Currently, there's a disclosures on MLS thing. This was actually put in almost a year ago now, but we're trying to make sure that every single listing has disclosures on them. We're going to talk about that in a moment. But this is also where you guys will see any notices that the anticipated closing date is out of date. So signing into Matrix, even though that's not something that everybody does every day, we also include an email that gets sent out. So that starts one day after the anticipated closing date. So if you guys don't end up closing the listing, again, after 30 days, we'll go ahead and send out a fine notice. If it doesn't get updated after that, we'll go ahead and fine again. This could lead to some issues with you actually getting into our system at all, but typically it doesn't make it all the way there. Next, we also wanted to talk about the firm exclusives. The firm exclusive rules were actually adjusted. This was back in 2020, whenever NAR introduced the Clear Cooperation 8.0 information. This included the coming soon details, but there was also a rehashing of how firm exclusives are handled and whether or not firms themselves could actually just choose not to share their data, even though they were putting the information into the MLS, and then subsequently getting all the benefits of the MLS without having to share. So we've done away with a lot of that, but the firm exclusive rules have changed. If you do end up having a seller that does not want their listing to be shared on the MLS, all you got to do is just let us know that that's happening, send in the form within 1 business day, and subsequently do not market it. And actually, I wanted to mention this one as well, just because we have had some issues with this more recently. But if you guys are signed in to the MLS portal under forms and contracts, and then under residential contract, there's a section here for the firm exclusive. And in here, it does explicitly mention that this cannot be publicly marketed. So if you guys do end up noticing a listing that is not in the MLS and is being marketed on websites or on Facebook or has a sign in the yard or anything, it's important to note that that is not allowed. So also, we wanted to mention the disclosures. Obviously, this has been a hot topic as we saw in Matrix. We've already got a notice up there to ensure that everybody is aware that disclosures are required on every single listing that requires a disclosure for just the listing itself. So unless you have a listing that's exempt in some way, you have to have that disclosure updated and uploaded into the listing. That has to be done within 1 business day. We are pretty prompt about making sure people are aware that they're missing the details on that. We're trying to make sure that we also notice whether or not people are trying to fake us out. So if you guys happen to come across a listing that has some other document that's been uploaded besides a disclosure, or has marketed it as a disclosure without putting in the disclosure, that's a violation. Please let us know if you find those. And we'll talk about how to report those in a moment here. All right. So let's now talk about our statuses. Now, it used to be that this wasn't as much of a concern, but we have a new status that we added back in 2020, the coming soon status. So I just wanted to do a quick coverage of the statuses before we move on. Now, coming soon properties do have their own separate section in the rules and regulations. And I actually wanted to point out they are all collected into one location. In fact, actually, it's very easy to find them. If you guys just scroll down to where it's got section 2.5, this is going to be the coming soon rules and regulations. Now, primarily what this boils down to, let me clear up all the highlighting there. What this boils down to is that you're going to be announcing that a listing will be available in the system. And how that looks is that you have a property that is not ready for showing. It's not going to be allowing any offers to be made on it either. And it'll have to be ready within 10 calendar days. That means that the list date can't be older than 11 days from the date that it is listed to the date that it is showing and active. Now, when you guys set that date, it cannot be moved backwards. So what that means is that if you guys end up setting the date for, let's say you guys got your listing agreement on the 1st, and you guys want to make sure that it's available on the 10th, if you guys end up putting the 10th as the showing start date, and the seller says, hey, look, we got all the repairs that we were hoping to finish done, and it's only day 5. Fortunately, you're still going to have to wait until day 10 before you guys can start showing it and accepting offers on it. This is something that they actually have to agree to. And in fact, we even have a coming soon seller authorization that can be found under that same forms and contracts link that we found the firm exclusives under. This means that the seller is made aware of that. If they didn't read it, tough. They need to know that this is how the system works. So we typically try not to put too much emphasis on this, but as always with anything else, agents need to make sure that the sellers are aware of everything that they need to be involved with, and no more so than the coming soon. So if you guys have a client that's wanting to move that date back, just remind them of the form that they signed. Now, we specifically state that the date can't be moved back, but I did want to mention that you can move the date forward. So again, let's say that we have something that was listed on the 1st. You guys initially set the coming soon showing start date as the 5th. And lo and behold, the repairs are taking longer, the painting isn't done yet, whatever the case may be, you can move that date to day 7, day 9, day 10, but it can't be moved past that 10 days. And in fact, actually, if you guys do have a listing that was in the coming soon status and it's not ready to be shown after that 10 days, it's going to automatically be set to active by the system. And if that's not what you need, if the client is not ready to be shown, you'll have to move it into the withdrawn status, which we'll discuss in just a minute here. I also wanted to point out, this is the biggest violation that we noticed with the coming soon listings. There is a required statement that's meant to be put into the public remarks. This is a major issue that we've been noticing. People either not putting it on there to begin with, or they don't end up mentioning it in the public remarks, but rather put it into the realtor remarks. Always make sure that you guys are mentioning it's a coming soon listing. No offers or showings are available until such and such date, which is always going to be the showing start date. And again, all of that can be found under section 2.5. It's its own separate section. Effectively, all of the rules and regulations regarding the coming soon listings are torn directly from the recommendations that NAR made for coming soon listings. We have a couple tweaks that are a little bit unique to our MLS, but beyond that, this is just directly from what they recommended. Next, we have our active listings. This one's pretty self-explanatory. It's currently for sale. It can be shown. You just have to make sure that the listings are entered within 1 business day. The entered within 1 business day thing is actually now a requirement. It used to be that we had a little bit more leeway with this. It had to be entered within, a certain amount of days. We've completely gotten away with that, or done away with that rule. The clear cooperation policy that NAR recommended says 1 business day. That's what we're going to start sticking with. We also have a separate status that's going to be properties that can be shown, but have some kind of contingency on them. This is different than the normal usage of the term in the industry, contingent. This means that the contract of sale is contingent upon the buyer's property selling. So the property can still have offers made on it, but there is an offer that was already made with the buyer. But if you guys end up having a situation where they're not entirely sure it's going to be selling, or they might not even be able to move to begin with, then you can leave that in an active with contingent and gather up those backup offers, excuse me. You can also use this active with contingent for any properties that are on a short sale. Alternatively, if either of these criteria have been met, you can also put it into a pending status. Speaking of pending, pending status means that there is a sales contract signed by both buyer and seller. Now, I want to reinforce this because we have been noticing a big problem with this, not even just recently, just over the last few years. If a property ends up having a contract that's signed by both buyer and seller, it has to be put into pending. It doesn't matter if there's not any financing backed up. It doesn't matter if the earnest money hasn't been delivered. If the sales contract has been signed, it needs to be put in pending. We get a lot of phone calls from people. We get a lot of emails. We get a lot of violation notices of people saying that the property is in some kind of pending status. It's not accepting new showings or whatever the case may be. And it's just supposed to be in pending, but is still being marketed, maybe for those alternative backup offers or whatever the case may be, but that is not allowed. If the sales contract is signed by both parties, it needs to be put in pending. Also, there is a separate rule in regards to pretty much any status changes whatsoever that they have to be entered within 3 business days. So if you guys get that contract signed, you've got 3 business days to make sure that change is represented in the MLS. Whenever you do put a listing into the pending status, it also requires that that listing is the listing has an anticipated closing date added to it. And again, this is mostly just for you guys to make sure that you have effectively a reminder letting you know that, hey, this property that you had in pending that you haven't thought about for a while because the closing documents hadn't gotten completed or whatever the case may be, it has a date assigned to it. And again, it's very, very simple to actually update that. So if you guys do end up in a situation where you're getting those notices, but it's really just that the closing hasn't completed and you have a new date, just go in there, put that in there, and you're done. Easy peasy. All right, closed status, again, another one that seems pretty self-explanatory, is when the listing has actually had the sale go through, it's closed, and the title has passed from the from the seller to the buyer. There is a leased, which is just the residential lease equivalent. And actually, since we're mentioning the residential lease, it's worth pointing out, we have 2 different categories that the residential properties can be in. You're either selling the property or you're leasing the property. We don't have the same option for vacant land. Typically, it's going to just be a sale anyway. But we do get a lot of phone calls, and in fact, a pretty significant uptick in questions on this recently. We do not have a commercial lease option. We typically try to defer a lot of the commercial listings over to our Connect CIE sister company, which is a commercial information exchange. So if you guys do have a commercial lease that you guys wanted to have listed, I would get in contact with Connect CIE. We don't allow those in our system. We do have a withdrawn status as well. This is going to be for those rare instances where you have a listing that has a listing agreement that's still in full effect. But if you guys do have a situation where the property can't be shown or marketed, then it needs to be put into a withdrawn status. Now, this doesn't have a lot of specificity in our system or in our rules in regards to how long that situation is. But what it effectively boils down to is that if you have a listing that's not able to be shown, it should be put into withdrawn. If that's going to be for 1 day, you can block that out on a showing schedule, that's fine. If it's going to be for a week or a month, put it into withdrawn status to ensure that you're not getting inundated with phone calls about a listing that can't be shown or it can't be, you can't accept offers. Now, we also have the released status. I know that some people kind of flippantly use this to get rid of listing data in our system, but the released status is actually meant to indicate that the broker has terminated the listing agreement and the listing agreement is no longer in effect. If we do end up having a property that has been put into the release status, if we have any questions about this, you guys must have a copy of the release on file. That means that it has to have been signed by the broker and the seller. If we end up having a listing that was released just to try and shed some of the listing data from our system, we get in contact with you and you can't provide us the release form, that could be a big problem. We also have an expired status. This one, again, pretty self-explanatory. If you have an active listing, it'll have to have an expiration date assigned to that. Once that expiration date passes, it'll be put into an expired status. If you have a listing that had expired and you wanted to get it refreshed, because let's say that the listing is actually still in effect and you guys still want to make sure that it's getting marketed, there's a couple different options for that. If the property has been put in the system less than a year ago, it can be moved out to a full year. Now, all of our property statuses represent that. It used to be that if you were putting in a residential listing, it would expire after 6 months automatically, and then you'd have to put in a new listing and re-upload the disclosures to make sure you have fresh disclosures. We trust that everybody's going to be doing that. So what ends up happening is that if you have a listing that it's expired because it was on a 6-month contract, you can move that out to a full year. After that year, then it needs to have a brand new listing put in, import the data from the previous listing, and you can start back up again. All right. So now let's talk about just a little bit more nuance to our statuses. We have a status, or we have a option for having statistical purposes listings entered into the system. There's a lot of confusion about this, or if I'm being blunt, a lot of people that are just not using this properly. Our rules actually have pretty clear and explicit terminology for this. It has to be a property that's closed. That's the biggest problem that we have. We have a lot of people that'll put in a listing and it's entered for statistical purposes, and then they put it into a pending status and then just let it sit there. That's not allowed. The only time you can put in an entered for statistical purposes listing is after the listing has sold. Now, you must either have a signed listing agreement or a sales fee agreement with the seller. Now, it's important to recognize that sales fee agreement with the seller does mean that if you guys have a for sale by owner, that you guys end up facilitating the buyer's side of the transaction, you can enter that listing into the system. You'll be putting yourself as a listing agent and then non-MLS for the selling agent. But you have to have a sales fee agreement. And if questioned, we need to be able to see that sales fee agreement if there's some question as to the authenticity of this listing appearing in our system, because we don't want to just have a bunch of errant data that's being put into the system that doesn't have any real connection to properties moving. The listing also must include the sale of land. That's typical. That's every listing in our system. The property also must be entered within 5 business days of the closed date. This means that you can't just go through and just be like, oh, I did a bunch of for sale by owners last year. I've got a bunch of sales fee agreements that I have to represent that I actually did participate. It has to have occurred within the last 5 business days. End of story. Also, the public remarks must read entered for statistical purposes. So also, before we get into the data entry side of things, if you have a property where the seller is willing to lease the property instead, you do actually have the option to enter the property as both a for sale and a lease option, meaning you'll technically have 2 listings for the same property, but just in those different property types. Just make sure to release the other listing if the property does end up selling or end up leasing. So all of that can be found under 2.2, or in the case of the sale and lease, 2.4. All right, now let's get into some of the specifics on the data entry. I wanted to mention, in my opinion, one of the most important and overlooked rules in our system. This is effectively the responsibility of the listing agents whenever a listing gets entered into the system. Now, it's section 2.25, errors or omissions on listings. MLS Tech is not liable for any errors or omissions in the MLS. It's the listing participant's responsibility to check that their listings are accurate and complete. It is the listing participant's responsibility to correct any errors or omissions immediately. And actually, just so you guys are aware, most of the time, the rules don't add a lot of obnoxious stuff in there, like bolds or all caps, but this actually did make it in there. If you guys do end up having a listing that has some kind of error on it, it does have to be changed immediately. And they put it in all caps. Anyway, for issues that cannot be fixed by the listing participant, we do have an MLS change form, which will need to be signed by the broker or an authorized signer for the office or firm. This last part, signed by the broker or authorized signer, for some reason, this confuses people from time to time. We'll end up having people get in contact with us because they need to have something changed. They fill out a change form for it. And then lo and behold, their broker didn't actually end up signing this, or they end up getting the listing agent to sign it, which unless they're an authorized signer for that office, they are not allowed to do the signing. We have to make sure that the brokers are made aware of any of the problems that you guys are having with the system, or if there's any problems with the listings. So if something does get entered incorrectly, we want to make sure that that's represented accurately, but the broker needs to know that that was done and subsequently sign off on the changes. We also, we also wanted to clarify some other rules. So recently we have been noticing a dramatic increase in problems with the photos that are being added or the public remarks. The public remarks are meant to describe the property factually. We would typically like for people to just put in a very flat description of the property, but we also recognize that because the public remarks are typically being syndicated out and subsequently often being used by Zillow, Realtor.com, so on and so forth as effectively marketing for the property in text form, you may end up trying to describe it in a little bit more of a flowery way. It'd be best to try and avoid that just to ensure that people don't accidentally misinterpret some of that to mean something different. But it's important to recognize as well, do not include any information about yourself, your office, or any contact information for the seller. We also have noticed a lot of people have been adding in who the builder is. That's also not allowed. But again, do not put in any content that relates to yourself or the office. This is a big issue. This is a relatively big violation of the cooperation that the MLSs are meant to facilitate. Part of the reason why NAR's so upset about it is because it effectively directs people towards the listing agent's information rather than trying to facilitate some kind of cooperation with other brokerages. MLS is also not responsible for the content in the remarks. The participant is. So if you do end up noticing that there's some kind of fair housing violation, we can certainly provide any evidence of that, but it's still going to be the participant's responsibility to make sure that that information is updated. Additionally, the directions are actually something that we want to make sure actually includes a very clear path towards getting you to the property. We've noticed a lot of people recently, just in the spirit of brevity, trying to enter something similar to just use GPS or putting in the latitude and longitude. We've even seen people go so far as to say, you know, Google such and such address, it's next door, stuff like that. That's not allowed. If you guys are having any trouble with trying to get directions to the property, just find a central location to guide someone from and then give them directions from that location to the property. It has to be turn by turn. It has to be something that if I lose cell phone service or don't have a smartphone, I can print off the directions and still find my way to that property without problem. So no use GPS, no just entering the subdivision name, that kind of stuff. My recommendation, thanks to someone who actually doesn't own a smartphone, I hope that's not still the case, but Even back in 2018, when I started doing outreach, somebody did actually mention that those directions are important for the very reason that he still has a flip phone, doesn't have a Garmin GPS, still has a printed map that he has to buy an updated version of from time to time. You can't assume that everybody's going to have that stuff, even though honestly, I think that they're doing themselves a disservice. But anyway, additionally, we have our broker remarks. Again, this cannot include any builder's information or contractor's information, or even just any non-members. This is the one place in the system that you guys can mention seller or tenant information if that's going to be relevant to them selling the property. All right. Now, this is where we're starting to see a lot more violations, and I hate having to keep on mentioning that over and over again, but that is part of the reason why we have this class. So in regards to our media on listings like photos, virtual tours, we do have at least a couple little reminders. So despite some people's understanding, photos are actually not required for any listing with one exception. The only properties that actually, or the only listings that actually have to have a photo are the properties that are for auction. It has to have a primary photo and it has to have the word auction emblazoned on it. The main photo of any property that does include photos, so including those auction sales, has to be a front exterior of the house, or in the last couple of years, we've also added in an aerial view option of the property. We would still prefer for people to add in a front exterior of the house. I mean, the real impetus behind this rule originally was to try and make sure that if you're driving along, trying to find whatever the address is, it's always something so abstract, a number, a street address, whatever. But if you have a photo of the property, you can use that to say, oh, that's the one that I was looking for. An aerial view of the property can still kind of provide the same thing, but we also added that option in mostly because we have vacant land. I mean, driving along vacant land along the road, it's not exactly going to be clear where you are, which property it is, or where the lines are, whatever. You see an aerial view of the property, it'll still accurately represent what's being sold. And this is the big violation that we've been seeing a lot of recently, is no self-promotion. That means no pictures of signs, no images with contact information, which I don't even know why people think that this is acceptable to begin with, but it also means that your virtual tours that are being added cannot have any branding whatsoever. So if you do find yourself in a situation where you have a virtual tour that someone has produced for you and they send you a link to that, make sure that the link that they provide is a unbranded version. And any reputable virtual tour creator, Tour Factory, Matterport, et cetera, they're all going to be able to provide you with an unbranded version. We also wanted to point out, and this was actually a rule that was added because of the complications with YouTube, you cannot use YouTube videos. Now, the reason that is because if you upload something to YouTube, there is no way to upload it unbranded. You have to put it onto a channel, but even if you did end up creating some, anonymous real estate virtual tours or something like that YouTube channel, immediately after that video is over, it's going to present whoever was viewing it with a medley of potentially completely unrelated or dangerously branded related content. So we just don't allow any YouTube videos to be used as virtual tours. There is a less often problem with this, but we also don't want any photos of people, pets. We've even seen some photos where there's just children in the photos, and I don't know about you guys, but that's a little upsetting. I don't want to let anybody know where they can find people. But we also do see occasionally, and especially on vacant land listings, photos of animals. Maybe there's a large property that has a bunch of acreage and, oh, cool, there's hunting available. You can't take pictures of photos and add those. All of the photos have to be related to the property. Now, if there's somebody, far in the background or in the outside the frame or partially outside the frame, pets, animals, whatever, that's fine as long as they are not the focus of the image. So if you want to take a picture of the open plains and there just happens to be a few cows or happens to be a deer hiding in the background or whatever, that's acceptable. But if it's anywhere close to being the focus of the image, that's going to be a problem. Also, model homes are allowed. Previously, we had some issues with this because new construction needs to find a way to represent something, even if the property isn't physically created yet. Model home photos are allowed. Renderings of the property are allowed. Even floor plans of the property can be acceptable. It's just important to note it has to accurately represent what the buyer will be getting. If it does not, it won't be acceptable. We also want to clarify there's no modification of images. Thankfully, this is something I've literally never seen a problem with. But outside of just changing the lighting on a property, so like, you may have noticed those photos of houses where it just looks like it was taken directly from Pleasantville. It's just the perfect sunset in the background. All the lights are wonderful, blah, blah, blah. That's fine. But if there's a fire hydrant in the front of the property, you can't edit that out. If there's a tree that's kind of giving a little bit of coverage that you don't want to show and you want to show the house a little differently, just move your camera. Don't edit that out of the photo. So other than creating CMAs, you also cannot use photos from another listing. This, again, is another thing that we've been noticing recently. Somebody might have sold a property and then subsequently the buyer is now suddenly a seller after they're trying to flip the property. And whoever it was that had previously listed it will have their photos lifted from that previous listing and used for a new listing. That is not acceptable unless you have explicit written permission from the person who got the copyright for those photos and get that updated. Next, we have, in my opinion, the most dry stuff, the division of commissions. So the listing in the MLS is an offer of cooperation and compensation. Now, we've talked about this a little bit already, but our entire organization, all of our rules and regulations, all revolve around the idea of cooperation. Now, since that's the case, we do not allow, and of course the system in turn doesn't allow, for listings to be entered without any compensation. We have seen a couple people trying to get around the system's restrictions recently. We found a way to try and make sure that that doesn't happen. But if you guys do come across a listing that's not offering any compensation, that's a problem. You can let us know. I would also suggest discussing that with their broker because that's not going to be helpful. It's also worth mentioning that at least currently, compensation is not a public field. We are actually trying to get that set up. It is a restricted field currently, though. So that's something that's only meant to be viewed by MLS participants and users outside of obviously the transactional obligations that will occur whenever a property goes into the offering stage. Now, we clearly state all of this in 10.1, but when you're creating reports in Matrix, be sure that you're always using the client versions, or you may end up accidentally sharing some information that you're not allowed to disseminate outside of the MLS membership, again, like the compensation values. Oh, and actually an important side note, since we're talking about the compensation, we are actually in the process of trying to institute a new tracking mechanism. So whenever somebody changes the compensation on a listing, there will be a mark on the history of that listing. So that means that if you do have a situation where someone has changed the price, you guys will be able to see what the previous price was and the exact second that that listing was changed. We are going to have a new section on our history that's going to show any of the compensation changes as well. Part of this is, I mean, as with most of our rules and regulations, it's in reaction to something. We have had some people that have actually or supposedly made changes to the compensation values after a listing has had an offer on it. So it was 1%, it decreased when it went pending, and then suddenly everybody gets to the tables at the end to try and do the closing, and lo and behold, that's a different value than what you had originally gotten. And some, I mean, I don't know why people would do this. It's safe to assume that everybody's going to have some record of what it was previously, and that is exactly what happened in one case. Subsequently, decided that we're going to just have to start showing it in history so that people can't get away with that. All right. Now, just some general compliance issues. This is going to be relatively quick and painless. Access to the MLS is restricted to just members and users. We have paths for assistants to get set up with access. Do not let anybody else sign in as you to get information. That includes your buyers. Don't let them sign into the MLS just to go searching for homes on their own. There is an entire client portal just for that. So we have that client front end that prevents buyers and sellers from seeing information that they shouldn't have access to. Do not give your MLS access to anyone by sharing your username or password. And I don't mean don't show it to anybody else except for your assistant or your broker or your husband or wife. Don't share your password. End of story. Do not sign in as someone else. If you end up having someone who's shared their information with you, don't sign in as them. Now, one of the main things that we want to mention that for, and we'll mention this a little bit more later, is that the system does actually restrict people if they do end up noticing suspicious logins, but I'll talk about that more in a moment. We also wanted to mention, if you do end up sharing a listing that is not your own, so if you guys wanted to advertise another team member's listing or somebody else in your office, or you found a property that you think other people might be interested in that's nearby you, you always need to make sure that you share that disclaimer based on information from MLS Technology Inc. for the period date through date. So make sure that that's shared. I'll be honest, a lot of the services that you guys have access to that will allow you to share any listing data will automatically have that shown on there. It's just important to recognize that that's there and available. All right. Now, let's talk a little bit briefly about the data entry side of things. So we mentioned already that a lot of these rules are related to the listing entry. But I wanted to clarify just some things that the system will do whenever you're trying to add a listing in. And I'm assuming most of you guys have add edit permissions, but even if you don't, this is just good information. Whenever you guys are adding in a new listing, it'll always try and double check the address that you're adding in. So if you try to add a listing in that's actually not eligible because there's already an active or withdrawn listing in the system, active, pending, or withdrawn, excuse me, it'll verify that based on the house number and street name. Now, the error message that you'll see in regards to this will actually show under this little question mark here. It'll appear with this little icon. So it might say something that seems kind of unrelated, but it'll say something like duplicate name, or that street name is not allowed, or something like that. You can always click on these little tooltip icons and it'll clarify for you what the issue is. So for instance, if I tried to put in something that wasn't acceptable, so for instance, if I tried to put in, where's one that I can put in intentionally wrong? There we go. So I put that in, click validate. It's actually going to tell me what the problem is. So it has to be current date is within the last 7 days. If the status is incomplete, the state cannot be changed for active status. So once this listing goes live, it can't be changed, that kind of stuff. Oftentimes we will end up getting phone calls about some listing that's not allowing people to get into it or whatever the case may be. But one of the first things that we're going to ask is, what screen are you looking at? And if it has some kind of error message, what does the error message say? And oftentimes this is all you actually really need to know anyway, but we can always clarify that information if you guys see something that's unusual, or if it's not being clear about what it is that needs to happen, or whatever. I also wanted to point out, I'm using this validate option down here at the bottom. I can't recommend this enough. If you guys are entering listings into the system, always use this. In fact, actually, I'm the type of person that whenever I was entering some of the listings for like, we have some builders that have sent us over some comp data that are just entered for statistical purposes listings, just to help you guys do CMAs in the future and so on. Whenever I'm manually entering those listings for people under what's called a central load, I I just use that validate every time I'm finished with a page. Before I move from property info to rooms, I hit validate, make sure everything's copacetic, and then move on. We have a note for legal descriptions. The legal description does require a certain amount of characters to be entered. If the legal description is really short, for instance, if you guys maybe don't have one, or if you guys don't have one yet because it's new construction or the parcel hasn't been split off or whatever the case may be, you do have the option to put in section, township, and range, and then also either the county or the subdivision. So for instance, if I needed to put this in, I would say 19 north, 21 east, 32. And then also either Tulsa County or Minshall Park. You don't have to do both. You can if you want to, but you don't have to do both. It is also going to check to see that there is some text in here. So if it is too short, you can also add in that county or subdivision. I also wanted to point out, this is something that we've noticed recently, people will try to get this assigned. There we go. Tulsa, there we go. Now it'll appear. If you guys notice, there are some schools that have actually closed. You cannot use those. It will try to give you guys an error message once the listing has been closed or once the listing has been submitted. But you'll notice that it actually is not giving me a tooltip telling me that this is incorrect. But we try to make sure that this is up to date. In fact, we actually had a school that closed in Broken Arrow, and even the school was still technically open. Like the school was still active, but they weren't taking new enrollments, and there was not going to be another school year after that. We marked it as closed, and we got a bunch of people calling in saying, hey, I still need to mark it as this school. Well, if the school is closed, it's not going to work. Also, please make sure that the map is correct. In fact, we actually have an automatic notification on our end on the service desk. We notice a lot of times people will end up putting in all of the information, and then they just hit this get lat long from address, and it might end up putting it in a completely random part. We've seen listings in Washington, D.C. We've seen things listed in Colorado. We've seen things listed in Saskatchewan, Canada. And worst case scenario, we've actually seen some that have been mapped all the way to China, which is always fun to find those. But always make sure that you guys are double checking that. In fact, actually, after you end up doing this get lat long from address, you can click on this set lat long manually, and it'll open up a little page here. Just zoom out, find out what exactly it is that you guys have it located in, so that you don't end up accidentally hurting yourself with where your listing is located, because there are people that are going to be looking for properties based on the map. All right. Oh, and just as a reminder, home square footage has to come from one of 3 different sources. This is mentioned explicitly in our rules and regs, but it has to come from either the appraiser. You have to have the documentation for that. A building permit, again, have to have a copy of the documentation on that, or the courthouse records, which you don't have to have the documents on. It's already on the courthouse records. We can check that in Realist. If you do not have one of those, the square footage has to be 0, and you have to put not reporting. There is a separate section up here at the top that's house size, so you can at least provide an estimate. As long as we're not giving an exact number, you're not going to be in violation. We unfortunately had to institute this rule because we used to have an owner option, and somebody listed a square footage that was just radically off of what the actual square footage was. The buyer ended up doing an appraisal, found out that the square footage was off and that they had overpaid. It was a big hassle. So we instituted that rule because of that. What's the old saying? All laws are written in blood. Anyway. All right. So this is our last note, and then we'll go ahead and close up shop. Do not share passwords with anyone else. I know I was mentioning it before, but again, we've gotten a lot of issues recently. If you do end up sharing your password with someone else and they sign in as you, if you happen to sign in recently, it's just going to end up looking like someone has broken into your account. You will end up having your account locked, and then you will end up having to face the consequences of that. I wanted to clarify, Any violation of the system password ID is a fine of $500 per violation. If we find out that somebody has been signing in as you, we have, unfortunately, very meticulous records of who's been signing in from what device, where they're physically located, how fast you would have had to move if you had signed in one place and then signed in another place. I mean, some of this stuff is obnoxious. Like we had somebody that signed in and then signed in again, and it was 952 miles an hour that they would have had to travel in order to travel that distance. So don't share your password. That's our final note. But thank you guys so much for joining us today. If you end up having any problems or questions or anything like that about any of our rules and regulations, get in contact with us. We're more than willing to field any of those questions. And if you happen to notice any violations while you guys are exploring any properties, please don't hesitate to report them. There's a very simple report a violation button right up here at the top. If it does have some kind of violation, there's a couple generic things. Even if it's something that doesn't match one of these, write your concern in here. Even though it does say who it is that's originally reporting it, this will be your information, obviously. When you report it, it comes through anonymously. We have to do some pretty significant digging to find out who it is that reported it in case there is some kind of problem with it. But do us all a favor. If you find a violation, report it, and we'll try and make sure that we have good, clean data. So thank you guys so much for joining us. Class is officially over. I'm going to leave the session open for a little while if you guys have any questions you would like to ask immediately, but beyond that, we're all set. Yeah, no problem at all, guys. Stay safe. Hopefully we'll get back to doing the in-person classes soon. We're just waiting for the threat level to go down for COVID. So keep wearing your masks, keep social distancing, and hopefully we'll be able to get back to normal life soon, but it's not quite safe yet. Yeah, no problem at all. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and close up shop. And thank you guys for joining us today. Sorry, it's kind of dry, boring material, but oh no, you're good. Yeah, we're good with the with the rules class. But I appreciate it. Have a good one, guys. Stay safe.